Welcome to Beyond Borders, the Immigration Evaluation Podcast. Whether you're just starting to explore how to add immigration evaluations to your practice, or you've been conducting evaluations for years, this is the place for you. I'm Dr. Mariella Shibley, and I can't wait to share today's episode with you.
Hi there. Last time I was talking about asylum and the new trends that I'd been noticing, and how oftentimes I've been asked to assess a person's competency in immigration court. So today's episode focuses on this very specific topic, competency in immigration court, what it means, how it differs from competency in criminal court, and what mental health professionals are called upon to evaluate in these cases. So if you're a clinician who's been asked to conduct a competency evaluation, or you're considering adding this to your practice, and this conversation will give you a clear foundation. And if you find this helpful, I encourage you to join my upcoming live training, where we'll go into far more detail, including clinical approaches, evaluation templates, and how to effectively communicate the findings in a legal context. So let's start today by comparing competency in immigration court to competency in the criminal justice system. So they may sound similar, but they actually function quite differently. So at first glance, both systems seem to be asking the same question, and that is, can this person understand what's happening and participate in their case? But the legal and procedural context surrounding that question is very different. In criminal proceedings, individuals are protected by the U.S. Constitution, most notably the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees the right to legal counsel and the right to confront witnesses and the right to a fair trial. And this is why we have public defenders and federal defenders for individuals who cannot or don't want to retain the services of a defense attorney. Now, immigration proceedings are classified as civil, not criminal. And this means that the same constitutional protections do not automatically apply, even though the outcomes can be equally or sometimes in cases even more impactful. So, for example, in immigration court, there is no right to a court-appointed attorney. So respondents may have legal representation, but they have to pay out of their own pocket. And many of them appear in court without one. And so due process protections, though they exist, they are often limited or discretionary, especially these days. So while both systems assess competence, the rights afforded to the individual and the implications of the finding of incompetence, which I'll get into next, are not the same. So let's talk about how competence is defined in each setting. In criminal court, the standard comes from Dusky versus United States. So to be considered competent, a person must have a rational and factual understanding of the proceedings and the ability to consult with an attorney with a reasonable degree of understanding. So if someone doesn't meet the standard, the court is obligated to pause proceedings. The expectation is that the individual's competence will be restored, typically through psychiatric treatment or some kind of structured intervention, before the case can continue. So it puts a pause on the case. That's criminal court. Now let's look at immigration court, where the standard comes from a different case. And that is the matter of MAM, or matter of MOM, which is a present decision by the Board of Immigration Appeals from 2011. And this decision was based on a real case of a man from Jamaica, whose initials are MAM, thus the name, who had been a lawful permanent resident in the U.S. since he was 10 years old. So in 2008, the government started removal proceedings based on several criminal convictions. But what made this case significant wasn't the criminal history, it was what happened in the courtroom. So when this respondent appeared in immigration court, he was clearly struggling. He couldn't answer basic questions like his own name or birth date. He told the judge that he had schizophrenia and then said that he needed medication that he hadn't received while he was in detention. And he did not have legal representation. So when asked if he could represent himself, he said he wasn't sure. Now, eventually, under pressure, he told the judge that he would, quote unquote, do the best he could. Now, there were medical records confirming his diagnosis and even a prior criminal court finding that he was unfit to stand trial. But despite all of this, the immigration judge didn't pause to assess his competence. There was no formal ruling, no competency hearing, so the judge completed the proceedings and then ordered him deported. Now, when the Board of Immigration Appeals reviewed the case, they realized that there weren't any clear procedures in place for what immigration judges should do when there are signs, clear signs, that someone may not be competent. So the board issued a decision that created what we now refer to as the MAM framework, MOM framework. And that is a presumption of competence, a duty to evaluate when indicia of incompetency are present, and a requirement that appropriate safeguards be put in place when someone is found not competent. So in that sense, the matter of MOM didn't just address one individual case. It set nationwide guidance that continues to shape how competency is assessed in immigration court today.
If you're ready to grow your income and impact, head to the link in the description box to learn more about my training program. For now, let's get back into the episode.
In immigration court, a respondent is presumed competent unless there are indicia of incompetency. In other words, observable signs that raise concern. So if there are such concerns, then the immigration judge must evaluate whether the person can, 1, understand the nature and purpose of the proceedings, 2, consult with an attorney or representative, and 3, reasonably present and examine evidence. So this is a different structure. Unlike in criminal court, there's no requirement that the case be paused and no mandate to provide services that aimed at restoring competence. Instead, if the person is found not competent, the judge is instructed to implement appropriate safeguards. And that brings us to another important distinction. So in criminal court, a finding of incompetence leads to an immediate halt in the proceedings, an expectation of restoration via treatment, and continued legal representation, typically at state expense. In immigration court, a finding of incompetence leads to implementation of safeguards, but the case continues. There's no requirement for restoration services, and there's also no guarantee of legal counsel unless the individual qualifies for very specific protections. One of those protections is linked to the Franco Gonzalez versus Holder case, which led to the creation of the National Qualified Representative Program. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But overall, the key point here is that the consequences of a finding of incompetence are very different between the two systems. So let's shift to what we as mental health professionals are actually being asked to evaluate. In immigration court, the standard set by the matter of MOM asks us to assess whether the respondent understands the nature and purpose of the proceedings, whether they can consult with a representative, and whether they can reasonably present and examine evidence. And this includes evaluating their understanding of why they're in court or why they're in an immigration proceeding, what the possible outcomes are, such as deportation or relief, who the various courtroom players are, meaning the judge, the DHS attorney, their own counsel, what rights they have, including representation, presenting evidence, cross-examining witnesses, appealing a decision, And we also assess whether they can make informed decisions about waiving or exercising their rights, to respond meaningfully to allegations or charges, to provide relevant information to support their case, and follow the flow of the hearing and act on instructions given by the judge. So, importantly, our role is not to determine legal competence. That's the judge's job. Our role is to provide a clinical evaluation of the respondent's mental functioning, particularly how it affects their ability to meet these legal benchmarks. So if there are deficits across multiple areas, especially due to a mental disorder or cognitive condition, that may support a legal finding of incompetence. Now, let me briefly revisit Franco Gonzalez versus Holder. This federal case led to a settlement that created the National Qualified Representative Program, or NQRP. And that applies to detained immigrants in specific jurisdictions, which include California, Arizona, and Washington, who are found legally incompetent due to a serious mental disability. So if those conditions are met, the respondent becomes eligible for government-funded legal representation. In some cases, the court may also order a psychological evaluation or request additional information about the respondent's functioning. So clinically, this means that our evaluations, particularly those that speak clearly to cognitive capacity or to psychiatric symptoms and the ability to participate, can serve as the gateway to safeguards or appointed counsel. So in summary, while both immigration and criminal courts ask whether someone is competent, they are asking it in very different ways and with very different legal implications. For those of us conducting competency evaluations in the immigration context, the focus is not on treatment or restoration. It's on assessment. Our task is to provide clear, functional insight into whether the individual is able to understand the process and to engage meaningfully with her case. So let's bring this all together. Competency evaluations in immigration court are fundamentally different from those in criminal court, even though they might sound similar on the surface. In criminal court, you have constitutional protections, and if you're found incompetent, then the case stops, you get treatment, and the system works to restore your competency before moving forward. In immigration court, it's a civil process. There's no automatic right to an attorney. There's no guarantee of restoration services. And if someone's found incompetent, the case doesn't necessarily stop. Instead, the judge puts safeguards in place and the proceedings continue. So our job as clinicians isn't to make the legal determination, it's to assess whether the person can understand what's happening, work with their attorney, and participate in their own defense. We're looking at their mental functioning and how it impacts their ability to engage with the process. And in some cases, particularly for detained individuals in certain states who meet specific criteria, our evaluation can be the key that unlocks access to legal representation that they wouldn't otherwise have. So while the work is complex, it's also incredibly meaningful. You're helping ensure that people who are facing life-altering outcomes have a fair opportunity to be heard. So if this work is part of your practice, or if you'd like it to be, I invite you to join me for a live training on this topic where we'll go into greater detail. We're going to go over what the evaluation should focus on, how to assess cognitive functioning and mental health status, go over case examples, and more importantly, how to communicate the findings effectively in your reports. So to learn more or register, just follow the link in the episode description or just look it up on the website. And thank you for listening and, again, for the work that you do.
That's a wrap up for today. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a fellow mental health provider who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss my next episode.